For most people, Machiavelli is a name associated with ruthless politicians, corporate backstabbers, and motivational quotes about power that sound edgy on LinkedIn. He's treated as a philosopher of manipulation, a cynical thinker who taught leaders how to lie, cheat, and betray their way to the top. But that version misses the point entirely. Because when you strip away the moral panic and the centuries of misreading, you discover something far more interesting. Machiavelli wasn't obsessed with cruelty. He was obsessed with survival. He wasn't interested in evil, ambition, or domination for its own sake. He was interested in fiscal reality. And in a world where Italian city-states were bleeding themselves into irrelevance through financial mismanagement, Machiavelli became the first thinker to make one truth uncomfortably clear. The greatest danger to a state isn't moral corruption. It's running out of money. People think The Prince is about power. It's really about solvency. Welcome to finance history, where money, morality, and survival collide. And nothing is ever as simple as the moralizers claim. To understand Machiavelli's financial genius, you have to understand the time he lived in, because his ideas didn't appear out of nowhere. They were born in a world collapsing under the weight of its own incompetence. Italy during the late 15th and early 16th centuries was a bloodbath of economic stupidity. Fractured city-states, each convinced of their own importance, each hiring expensive mercenary armies they couldn't afford, and each watching foreign powers, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, carve up the peninsula like it was a business transaction. War was constant. Alliances shifted daily. Treasuries emptied faster than taxes could refill them. And rulers kept making the same mistakes, borrowing from bankers, trusting mercenaries, and believing that good intentions would somehow translate into state survival. States weren't just fighting wars. They were conducting suicide missions funded by loans they had no plan to repay. Whenever a duke raised an army, he was mortgaging his future. And far too often, the bill came due before victory ever did. Most modern readers imagine Renaissance Italy as a place of artistic brilliance and cultural refinement. But in this period, politics was financial before it was anything else. The moment a ruler made a decision, the meter started running. You needed soldiers, weapons, fortifications, bribes, spies, diplomats, and all of them demanded payment up front. A campaign lasting more than a few months could bankrupt a city-state. A campaign lasting more than a year could end with foreign occupation. And because these states were trapped in a cycle of vanity and fear, they kept spending anyway. It was an arms race funded by Italian banks, and it was destroying the entire peninsula from within. This is the world Machiavelli walked into, not as a philosopher writing abstract theory, but as a government official forced to solve financial crises disguised as political ones. In popular culture, we romanticize him as a kind of Renaissance villain. But in reality, he was closer to a budget analyst. He looked at the numbers, the debts, the mercenary contracts, the failed wars, and realized that the way Italian states were governed was financially insane. Survival meant nothing if the treasury was empty. And most rulers never understood that. They believed the enemy's army was their greatest threat. Machiavelli believed their own spending was. That's why the most important chapter in The Prince isn't about deception or cruelty. It's about military finance. Before he ever talks about foxes and lions, or whether it's better to be feared than loved, Machiavelli writes about mercenaries. And his argument is brutal and economic. Hiring mercenaries is financial suicide. Not because mercenaries are immoral, but because they're expensive, unreliable, and structurally designed to prolong conflict for profit. He spends entire passages explaining how mercenary captains have no incentive to win quickly, because quick victories in their contracts. How they drain state coffers while delivering minimal results. How they switch sides whenever another employer offers more money. Machiavelli isn't moralizing. He's accounting. And his conclusion is clear. A state that relies on hired soldiers will eventually go bankrupt and lose its independence. Even his most famous ideas turn out to be economic principles in disguise. When he says a prince must learn not to be good, he's not endorsing cruelty. He's warning that moral rigidity is a luxury only financially secure states can afford. When he argues that generosity can destroy a ruler, he's stating a literal fiscal truth. Rulers who spend lavishly to appear generous exhaust their treasuries and are forced to raise taxes, which makes them hated. Better to be called stingy and stay solvent. When he emphasizes decisiveness, military preparedness, and brutal pragmatism, it's because these traits prevent the financial disasters that kill states. Machiavelli wasn't trying to teach rulers how to be evil. He was trying to prevent them from bankrupting their states while trying to be virtuous. To understand how revolutionary this thinking was, you have to understand what Italian politics looked like before him. For centuries, political theory was written by churchmen and classical philosophers who treated governance as a moral exercise. Rulers were supposed to embody virtue, display piety, and govern with justice. Economic reality barely entered the discussion. But as banking, taxation, and warfare became more complex, this idealism became suicidal. States with virtuous rulers but empty treasuries collapsed under foreign invasion. Machiavelli saw that the old mindset had become a death sentence. Politics could no longer be treated as a stage for moral performance. It had become a survival game that required cold financial calculation. This is why Machiavelli is such an anomaly in political thought. While most theorists glorified virtue, he treated governance as resource management. He calculated military costs, tax revenues, and opportunity costs centuries before economists formalized those terms. He had no patience for rulers who chased moral approval at the expense of state survival, because he understood a truth that modern leaders often forget. Every political decision is ultimately a decision about fiscal sustainability. And if you miscalculate, you don't just lose power, you lose the state. When you finally read The Prince with this economic lens, the book stops sounding like a manual for tyrants and starts sounding like a risk management handbook. Machiavelli opens by explaining why principalities fail, and buried beneath the political language is a simple truth. They run out of money. He analyzes why new rulers struggle, not because they're inexperienced morally, but because they inherit debt, hostile populations, and expensive obligations without the revenue base to sustain them. He's performing a fiscal audit of political failure. And from the very first pages, Machiavelli makes clear that leaders who cannot manage finances have no business managing states. That's why so much of the book is about money rather than morality. Machiavelli devotes entire chapters to how rulers should raise and spend money. And the logic is brutal. He warns that princes who rely on mercenaries waste resources, that rulers who try to buy loyalty through gifts bankrupt themselves, that heavy taxation destroys the economic base that funds the state. He's not writing philosophy. He's writing fiscal policy. He explains that a wise ruler conserves resources during peace so they're available during war. That ransacking your own population for revenue destroys the state faster than any external enemy. That fiscal discipline is more important than battlefield courage. For a political treatise, it's weirdly uninterested in ideology and obsessively interested in whether the treasury can sustain the government's ambitions. He warns rulers to avoid unnecessary wars, not because war is immoral, but because it's expensive. He scolds leaders who let advisors drain state coffers through corruption, not because corruption is wrong, but because it's financially destructive. Machiavelli understood something modern states often forget. Public finances don't support governance. Public finances are governance. His approach to fortifications reveals the same financial logic. Today, when governments debate infrastructure spending or defense budgets, the discussion is framed in terms of security, prestige, or national strength. Machiavelli framed it in terms of cost-benefit analysis. A single well-placed fortress, he explains, can deter invasion more cheaply than maintaining a large standing army. A fortified city can survive siege longer, buying time for diplomatic solutions that avoid ruinous wars. He writes that the prince who understands how to make his state defensible without exhausting his treasury is wiser than the prince who conquers neighboring cities and bankrupts himself in the process. Fortifications aren't symbols of power. They're investments that reduce long-term military spending. Machiavelli saw infrastructure not as vanity projects, but as the cheapest form of deterrence available. He was the first political thinker to understand that misallocation of capital is misallocation of power. Even his emphasis on ruthlessness is fundamentally about economics. Cruelty well used, he writes, is cruelty employed once for all and necessary for securing one's power. Most readers interpret this as endorsing brutality. But Machiavelli's real meaning is subtler. Decisive action is cheaper than prolonged conflict. When he urges rulers to eliminate threats swiftly and completely, he's describing a cost-benefit principle. Use force efficiently to avoid the expenses of drawn-out struggles, civil wars, and rebellions that drain treasuries for years. Every month a ruler spends fighting internal enemies increases financial exposure. Stability achieved through one brutal act costs less than stability lost through hesitation. Machiavelli's famous preference for decisiveness, control, and calculated violence isn't moral philosophy. It's fiscal discipline, but his deepest financial insight is woven into the structure of the book itself. Every chapter is about sustainability. Every choice a ruler makes determines whether the state can afford to continue existing. Machiavelli doesn't oppose morality. He opposes waste. And the ultimate waste, in his view, is governing based on ideals that bankrupt the state. That's why he praises rulers who secure their power through practical measures, who maintain armies they can afford, who avoid wars they can't win, who tax fairly enough to avoid rebellion, but heavily enough to fund defense. To Machiavelli, these aren't cynical compromises. They're the primary responsibilities of leadership because they preserve the state's limited capital. In one of his most revealing passages, he warns that rulers who govern based on how things should be rather than how they are will bring ruin upon themselves. Behind the political language lies a cold accounting principle. If you budget based on fantasies instead of realities, you will eventually default. What makes Machiavelli's financial genius even clearer is how Italian states around him succeeded or collapsed based on whether they followed his logic. Florence, his own city, hired expensive mercenaries and foreign protectors, drained its treasury, and lost its independence. Milan poured wealth into territorial expansion, went bankrupt, and was conquered. Venice, the exception, maintained fiscal discipline, invested in its own military infrastructure, and survived. The states that recognized governance as financial management endured. The ones that treated politics as moral theater burned out. Machiavelli wasn't just theorizing. History was proving him right in real time. And this is where the story turns from Renaissance analysis to something far more contemporary. Because the uncomfortable truth is that Machiavelli's warnings have echoed through every political collapse of the last 5 centuries. Modern governments still make the same mistake he tried to prevent. They make promises they can't afford. They fund programs without revenue plans. They wage wars beyond their means. And then they watch their states fracture under debt. The Soviet Union collapsed, not because its ideology was wrong, but because its finances were unsustainable. European empires dissolved not because they lost moral authority, but because they couldn't afford to maintain them. Modern welfare states face crises not because their goals are bad, but because the math doesn't work. Machiavelli would have recognized the pattern instantly. Governments that ignore fiscal reality eventually collapse, regardless of their intentions. Meanwhile, the tools he championed, fiscal conservatism, military self-reliance, calculated pragmatism, strategic ruthlessness, have become the survival strategies of every enduring state. Modern realpolitik is Machiavelli. Austerity policies are Machiavelli. Strategic defense, spending, is Machiavelli. Nations that survive long-term do so by prioritizing solvency over ideology. The world's most stable governments still live inside Machiavelli's budget constraints, whether they admit it or not. But the clearest modern example of his influence is in how nations now think about state capacity itself. Machiavelli believed that the strength of a government came not from its moral authority alone, but from its financial resilience, its ability to fund itself, defend itself, and continue functioning without external dependency. He wrote in an era when Italian states collapsed because they relied on foreign loans and mercenary armies. We live in a world where nations face the same dilemma in different forms. Debt crises, military dependency, resource fragility, and a long-term cost of governing beyond your means. Machiavelli might not recognize the technology, but he would recognize the math. The deeper lesson, the one that most people miss, is that Machiavelli wasn't teaching rulers how to be tyrants. He was teaching them how to avoid state bankruptcy. His true genius was understanding that the cost of governance outlives any individual ruler. States do not fail because they lack virtue. States fail because they drain the resources that keep them coherent, independent, and functional. Power in Machiavelli's world is irrelevant if the treasury collapses afterward. The best government is the one that doesn't require constant bailouts to survive. And that's the lens through which The Prince suddenly becomes something entirely different. It's not a book about amorality or ambition. It's a book about sustainability. It's not about crushing opponents. It's about outlasting them. Machiavelli doesn't glorify conquest. He glorifies solvency. To him, the ruler who preserves state finances is wiser than the ruler who expands territory. The government that knows when not to spend is stronger than the one that spends out of vanity. Machiavelli's philosophy is not the philosophy of a tyrant. It is the philosophy of a treasurer, someone responsible for maintaining the long-term fiscal health of the state. In the end, Machiavelli's financial genius lies in his refusal to separate economics from politics. He understood that the two are inseparable, that governance is merely the most expensive responsibility a leader can assume, and that the ruler who miscalculates its cost signs the death warrant of the state itself. His message is simple, unsettling, and eternally relevant. Strength is not measured by how much power you claim, but by how long you can afford to keep it. And history shows that when political systems collide, it is not the most virtuous state that prevails. It is the most fiscally disciplined. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll bankrupt you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.